I met Sean at his nephew's Sweet 16 party. And honestly, I knew right away he was different from the usual guys I'd been wasting my time with. He had this whole stable, family man vibe going on. Good job. Close with his relatives. Actually seemed to have his life together. Most of the guys I'd been dating were still acting like teenagers. But Sean was a real adult. When he offered to get me a drink and actually listened when I talked, I could tell he was genuinely interested. By the end of the night, we ended up hooking up, and it felt like everything just clicked perfectly. He was sweet, attentive, and clearly smitten with me from the start. We became completely inseparable after that night. Sean would text me good morning every single day, plan these thoughtful dates, and introduce me to all his friends and family, like he was showing off some prize he'd won. His family seemed a little surprised by how quickly things were moving. I caught his mom making some comment about taking time to really get to know someone, but I could tell they liked me overall. Why wouldn't they? I was perfect for him. I had my life together. I was attractive, funny, and I made Sean happier than I'd ever seen any guy. When he suggested we move in together after just 6 months, I knew I'd made the right choice. This was exactly the kind of relationship I'd been looking for. Stable, committed, with a man who actually appreciated what he had. The wedding planning was like something out of a fairy tale. Sean let me make most of the decisions and never complained about the cost or the details. He just kept saying how lucky he felt and how he couldn't wait to spend the rest of his life with me. All my single friends were so jealous of how devoted he was, how he'd surprise me with flowers or plan romantic weekends away. When we got married exactly 1 year after we met, I felt like I'd won some kind of lottery. I had this amazing husband who worshipped me, a beautiful home, and this whole stable future stretched out ahead of us. Everyone kept saying how perfect we were together. And honestly, they were right. The first few years of marriage were pretty good. Sean was the ideal husband in a lot of ways. He helped with housework, remembered anniversaries, always made sure I felt taken care of. We had our routines and our inside jokes, and I genuinely enjoyed spending time with him. But somewhere around year 3, I started noticing things that bothered me, like how predictable everything had become. Sean would make the same pancakes every Sunday morning, humming the same songs, asking if I wanted whipped cream with that same dopey smile. We'd watch the same types of movies, go to the same restaurants, have the same conversations about our days. It was comfortable, sure, but it was also kind of boring. I'd scroll through social media and see my single friends posting pictures from rooftop bars and weekend trips, looking like they were having actual adventures while I was sitting at home in Sean's oversized t-shirt, watching him putter around the kitchen. Don't get me wrong. I knew I was lucky to have someone so devoted, but sometimes I wondered if I was missing out on something more exciting. Sean was so content with our little domestic routine that he never seemed to notice I might want something different. He'd gotten comfortable, maybe too comfortable, and stopped putting in the same effort he used to when we were dating. When I started working at the marketing firm, everything felt fresh and energizing again. The office was full of creative, ambitious people who were always talking about new projects and going out for drinks after work. That's where I met Marcus. He worked in the creative department, and he had this confidence that was completely different from Sean's gentle, steady personality. Marcus was the kind of guy who could walk into a room and immediately become the center of attention. He was funny and charming, but with this edge that made conversations feel exciting and unpredictable. At first, it was just friendly workplace banter. Marcus would stop by my desk to chat about projects, or we'd end up talking during lunch breaks. He had all these stories about places he'd traveled and things he'd done that made my suburban married life feel small by comparison. When a group from work started going out for happy hour on Fridays, Marcus always made sure to sit next to me, and I found myself looking forward to those conversations more than I probably should have. But it was harmless, right? I was just enjoying having a friend who found me interesting and fun to be around. Sean started commenting that I seemed happier lately, more energetic, and I told him it was just because I loved my new job, which was true, in a way. I did love how alive I felt when I was at work, how Marcus would light up when he saw me, how our conversations could go anywhere. Sean would ask about my day, and I'd tell him about projects and meetings, but I'd leave out the parts about Marcus. Not because anything inappropriate was happening, but because I knew Sean wouldn't understand. He'd probably get jealous over nothing, and I didn't want to deal with that drama. The night everything changed. A bunch of us had stayed late to finish a big presentation, and Marcus suggested we grab dinner to celebrate. It was just the 2 of us by then. Everyone else had other plans, and we ended up at this little wine bar talking for hours. Marcus told me how refreshing it was to meet someone who was actually interesting, how most people were so boring and predictable. He said I had this energy that drew people in, and that he'd been thinking about me outside of work. The way he looked at me when he said it made my heart race, in a way it hadn't in years. When he kissed me in the parking lot, I should have stopped it. I should have thought about Sean and our marriage and all the reasons this was wrong. But in that moment, all I could think about was how incredible it felt to be wanted like this, to feel that electric excitement I'd been missing for so long. Marcus made me feel alive and desirable and special in a way that Sean's steady, predictable love never could. This was passion. Real passion. And I deserved to feel this way. I told myself it was just one kiss. Just one moment of weakness. But Marcus started texting me constantly after that. Good morning messages that were flirtier than anything Sean had sent me in years. Inside jokes from work. Pictures of places he wanted to take me. When he suggested we meet for lunch, I said yes. When lunch turned into afternoon drinks, I didn't stop it. When he invited me back to his apartment, I knew exactly what I was doing. And I did it anyway. The guilt lasted about a day before I realized how ridiculous it was to feel bad about finally being happy. Sean had gotten lazy in our marriage, taking me for granted and assuming I'd be satisfied with his boring routine forever. He barely even tried to romance me anymore. When was the last time he surprised me with anything? When was the last time he'd looked at me the way Marcus did? Like I was the most fascinating person in the room. I wasn't some housewife who was supposed to be grateful for scraps of attention. I was a vibrant, attractive woman who deserved to feel desired and appreciated. Marcus and I started meeting regularly, and it was like having a secret life that was 1,000 times more exciting than my regular one. He'd take me to new restaurants Sean had never heard of, introduce me to his creative friends who actually had interesting things to say, make me laugh until my sides hurt. The sex was incredible, passionate and spontaneous in a way that made me realize how stale things had gotten at home. Marcus made me feel like the woman I was supposed to be, not just Sean's comfortable, predictable wife. At home, Sean started asking why I was always on my phone, why I seemed distracted during dinner, why I wasn't interested in our usual weekend plans. His questions felt clingy and suffocating after the freedom I felt with Marcus. I'd gotten used to someone who respected my independence, who didn't need to know every detail of my day or expect me to account for every minute. Sean's need for constant connection and reassurance started feeling needy and unattractive. I began pulling away physically because being intimate with Sean felt wrong when my heart was somewhere else. It wasn't fair to any of us to pretend everything was normal when I'd clearly outgrown our marriage. Marcus was talking about taking a trip together, about me meeting his friends properly, about what our life could look like if I wasn't tied down to someone who couldn't appreciate what he had. The future he painted sounded like everything I'd been missing. Spontaneous, passionate, full of possibility. When Sean started getting suspicious, asking more pointed questions about my schedule and my coworkers, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't keep living this double life. And honestly, I didn't want to. Marcus made me happier than I'd been in years, and I deserved to pursue that happiness instead of staying trapped in a marriage that had run its course. But I also wasn't ready to blow everything up with a messy divorce if there was another way. That's when I decided to ask Sean for a break. I sat him down one evening and explained that I needed some space to figure myself out. I think we should take a break, I told him. I just need to figure myself out. I don't want a divorce, just some space. It seemed like the mature way to handle things. Give myself the freedom to explore what I had with Marcus while keeping my options open. Sean looked hurt, but he didn't argue, which honestly surprised me. Maybe part of him knew we'd grown apart too. For a few days, it felt perfect. I could see Marcus openly, stay at his place, not worry about sneaking around or making excuses. Sean was giving me the space I'd asked for, and I felt like I was finally being honest about what I needed. Marcus and I talked about taking things to the next level, maybe moving in together, building something real. I was happier than I'd been in ages, and I started thinking maybe this break would give Sean some perspective too. Maybe he'd realize he needed to step up his game if he wanted to keep me. But then Sean ruined everything by violating my privacy. I came home one afternoon to pick up some clothes, and I left my phone and purse on the counter while I took a shower. When I came out, there he was, standing in our bedroom doorway with my phone in his hand, looking at me like I'd committed some terrible crime. "So this is what you meant by a break," he said, all quiet and controlled, which honestly made me angrier than if he'd just started yelling. How dare he go through my personal things? Just because we were married didn't give him the right to invade my privacy like some kind of stalker. I was standing there dripping wet in a towel, and he was acting like he was the victim when he was the one who'd violated my trust. Yes, I'd been talking to Marcus, so what? I'd asked for space, and that's exactly what I was using it for. Sean was the one who'd gotten boring and complacent. He was the one who'd stopped making me feel special or appreciated. What did he expect would happen when he took me for granted for years? The way he looked at me, like I was some kind of monster, was completely unfair. He'd driven me to this with his predictable routine and his assumption that I'd just be satisfied with mediocrity forever. I needed excitement. I needed someone who actually saw me and valued me. And I'd found that with Marcus. But instead of taking responsibility for his part in our problems, Sean wanted to make me the villain because I'd had the courage to find happiness elsewhere. I moved out that week, and Sean immediately filed for divorce. He could have fought for our marriage, could have tried to win me back, or suggested counseling, but instead he just gave up. That told me everything I needed to know about how much our relationship really meant to him. If he'd truly loved me, he would have been willing to work for me, to change and grow and become the kind of husband I needed. Instead, he took the easy way out and made me look like the bad guy. Honestly, I was relieved. Living with Marcus full-time was everything I'd hoped it would be. His apartment was in this trendy part of town where we could walk to amazing restaurants and bars. His friends were artists and musicians and entrepreneurs, people who were actually doing interesting things with their lives instead of settling for suburban routine. We'd stay up late talking about philosophy and travel and dreams, then sleep in on weekends and make love in the afternoon. This was what life was supposed to feel like, passionate and spontaneous and alive. Marcus introduced me to things I'd never experienced: underground art shows, music festivals, parties where everyone was creative and free-spirited. We started experimenting with recreational drugs, just party stuff that made everything feel more intense and beautiful. For the first time in years, I felt like I was living instead of just existing. Sean's boring, safe little world seemed pathetic by comparison. I couldn't believe I'd wasted so much time being someone's predictable wife when I could have been having adventures and actually experiencing life. The divorce went through without much drama. Sean kept quiet about everything, didn't try to make things difficult or demand explanations. Part of me was impressed by his maturity, but mostly I thought it proved that he'd never really fought for anything important in his life. He just accepted whatever happened to him instead of taking control and making things happen. That was probably why our marriage had gotten so stale. Sean was content to coast through life while I needed excitement and growth and change. Marcus and I talked about getting married eventually, maybe taking a trip to Europe first, really building something amazing together. He had all these plans for starting his own creative agency, and he said I could be his partner in every sense of the word. This was the kind of relationship I'd always dreamed of. Two equals, supporting each other's ambitions instead of one person settling for less than they deserved. But then things started getting complicated in ways I hadn't expected. Marcus's creative projects weren't bringing in steady money the way Sean's boring corporate job had. The party lifestyle was fun, but it was also expensive, and I found myself charging things to credit cards that I'd planned to pay off later. Marcus said not to worry about it. Money was just energy, and we'd figure it out as we went. His confidence was part of what I loved about him. But sometimes I wondered if he was being realistic about our finances. When my family started asking questions about the divorce and my new lifestyle, I tried to explain that I was finally happy, but they didn't seem to understand. My sister made some comment about me throwing away a good thing, and my parents kept asking if I was sure I was making smart decisions. They'd always loved Sean, which was part of the problem. They couldn't see past his nice guy act to recognize how limiting our marriage had become. They wanted me to be grateful for stability instead of pursuing actual fulfillment. The drugs that had seemed like harmless fun at parties started becoming a more regular thing. Marcus said it helped his creativity, and honestly, everything felt better when we were high. The sex, the conversations, even just watching movies together. But it was getting expensive. And Marcus suggested I could help by borrowing some money from my family. Just temporarily, until his project started paying off. They had more than they needed anyway, and families were supposed to help each other out. I started with small things, borrowing some jewelry from my sister that she never wore anyway, taking a few tools from my dad's garage that had been sitting there collecting dust since he retired. My brother's gaming console was worth enough to cover our expenses for a week, and he barely used it anymore. It wasn't really stealing when it was family, and they should have been supporting me through this transition period anyway. They'd rather see me struggle than actually help their own relative get back on her feet. But then Marcus started getting weird about money, asking me to contribute more, getting frustrated when I couldn't cover my share of everything. The romantic partnership he'd promised started feeling more like a business arrangement, where I was expected to pull my weight financially. When I tried to talk to him about it, he said I was being needy and that he needed space to focus on his work. Space, the same thing I'd asked Sean for, except now I was on the receiving end and it felt completely different. One day I came back to Marcus's apartment and found my stuff packed in garbage bags by the door. He said he'd found someone who was more compatible with his lifestyle, someone who understood what he needed as an artist. Just like that, after everything we'd built together, everything I'd given up for him, he was throwing me away like I meant nothing. When I tried to argue, tried to remind him of all our plans and promises, he told me I was being dramatic and that I needed to grow up and move on. I discovered he'd been using my credit cards for his projects, running up thousands of dollars in debt that I'd somehow become responsible for. My bank account was empty. My credit was destroyed. And I had nowhere to go. The man I'd left my marriage for, the person I'd thought was my soulmate and partner, had used me and discarded me like I was nothing more than a convenient resource. My family wasn't exactly welcoming when I tried to explain what had happened. They'd figured out about the missing items, and my sister was furious about her jewelry. My parents said they were disappointed in the choices I'd made and that I needed to figure things out on my own. Even my brother, who'd always been supportive, said he couldn't trust me after I'd stolen from him. Everyone acted like I was some kind of criminal instead of someone who'd made a few desperate mistakes while trying to build a new life. I ended up sleeping in my car for a while, then in a tent when I couldn't afford gas anymore. It was humiliating and cold, and nothing like the adventure I thought I was signing up for. Marcus wouldn't even return my calls. And Sean had probably moved on with his boring, predictable life, never knowing how much I was suffering because of the choices I'd made. That's when I realized I had to swallow my pride and see if there was any chance of fixing things with Sean. Maybe enough time had passed that he could forgive me, that we could start over and build something better than what we'd had before. I knew it would be hard to convince him, but we'd had something real once, and maybe that foundation was still there underneath all the hurt and anger. When I showed up at his door, I was nervous but hopeful. I'd practiced what I was going to say, how I'd explain that I'd made mistakes but learned from them, that I understood now what really mattered. But when Sean opened the door and saw me standing there, his face went completely cold. I started explaining about Marcus, about how I'd been used and betrayed, about how I realized now that what we'd had was special. I was crying and probably not making much sense, but I needed him to understand that I was sorry, that I wanted to come home. He listened for maybe 30 seconds before he said, "Absolutely, the hell not," and started to close the door. I grabbed onto his arm, begged him to just hear me out, told him we could go to counseling or take things slow or whatever he needed. But he just shook his head and said this was my choice and I had to live with it. Then he shut the door in my face like I was some stranger instead of someone he'd promised to love forever. I spent the next few weeks trying everything I could think of to reach him. I called and texted and even wrote actual letters explaining how much I'd changed, how much I regretted everything, how we could have a better marriage if he'd just give me another chance. I told him about sleeping in a tent, about how alone I was, about how I'd realized that stability and loyalty were more important than excitement. I promised I'd be the wife he deserved if he'd just let me try again. Finally, he agreed to meet me for coffee. I was so relieved I almost cried right there in the coffee shop. This was my chance to show him that I was different now, that I'd learned from my mistakes and was ready to be the partner he needed. I told him about everything that had happened with Marcus, about how I'd been manipulated and used, about how I understood now what real love looked like. Sean listened quietly, and when I finished, he said he needed time to think about it. A few days later, he called and said maybe we could try spending some time together, but that I'd have to prove I was serious about changing. I was so grateful I would have agreed to anything. He said I could come over sometimes to cook dinner or help around the house, just to see how it felt to be around each other again. It wasn't exactly romantic, but I understood that I had to earn back his trust. For weeks, I did everything he asked. I cooked his favorite meals, cleaned his house, ran errands, basically tried to show him that I could be the supportive wife I should have been all along. It felt weird at first, almost like I was auditioning for my old life, but gradually it started feeling more natural. Sean was polite but distant, which I figured was normal given everything that had happened. I kept telling myself that this was just the beginning, that eventually he'd warm up and we could start rebuilding our connection. I started imagining our future together, how we'd renew our vows, maybe move to a new house where we could have a fresh start, possibly even have kids if that's what he wanted. I pictured telling people how we'd work through our problems and come out stronger, how true love could survive anything if both people were willing to fight for it. Sean seemed to be getting more comfortable with having me around, and I thought I could see glimpses of the old affection in his eyes sometimes. Then one evening, after I'd spent the whole day cleaning his house and making this elaborate dinner, Sean sat me down and said he had something to tell me. I thought maybe he was ready to talk about getting back together officially, or at least about me moving back in. Instead, he looked me straight in the eye and said, "I was never taking you back. I just wanted you to see what it feels like to be used." I couldn't even process what he just said. After everything I'd done for him these past few weeks, cooking his meals, cleaning his house, running his stupid errands like some kind of servant, he was telling me he'd been messing with me this whole time. Who does that? Who pretends to forgive someone just to twist the knife deeper? I thought Sean was supposed to be the nice guy, the good one in this situation. But this was straight up cruel. This was psychotic behavior. I'd been working so hard to prove that I'd changed, that I was sorry, and he'd been sitting there laughing at me behind my back like some kind of sociopath. What the hell had happened to the man I married? The Sean I knew would never be this vindictive, this calculating. He was acting like I was the only one who'd done something wrong here. But what he'd just done to me was worse than anything I'd ever done to him. At least when I was with Marcus. I wasn't trying to deliberately hurt Sean. I was just trying to be happy. But this was planned. This was him deciding to destroy me on purpose. I told him exactly what I thought of his sick little game and stormed out of there. I couldn't believe I'd actually thought we had a chance, that he was capable of forgiveness and growth. He was just as petty and small as I'd thought when our marriage started falling apart. Maybe I'd been right to leave him in the first place if this was who he really was underneath all that nice guy pretense. But walking away from Sean's house that night, I realized I had absolutely nothing left. No money, no place to live, no family willing to help me, no friends who hadn't gotten tired of my problems. The drugs Marcus had introduced me to had become more of a necessity than a choice. They were the only thing that made sleeping outside bearable, the only thing that quieted the constant anxiety about what was going to happen to me. I started doing things I never thought I'd do, just to survive. Asking strangers for money, sleeping in places that weren't safe, making choices that scared me, even as I was making them. The person I'd become was unrecognizable from the confident woman who'd walked into that sweet 16 party and swept Sean off his feet. Everything I'd touched had turned to ash, and I couldn't figure out how to stop the spiral. The night I ended up in the hospital, I honestly don't remember making a conscious decision about anything. I just remember feeling like there was no possible future where things got better, where I found my way back to being someone people could love and respect. The drugs and the desperation and the complete isolation had created this fog where nothing seemed real anymore, where the pain was the only thing I could count on. When I woke up in the psychiatric ward, my sister was sitting beside my bed, looking like she'd aged 10 years. She told me that Sean was doing well. He'd been working out, reconnecting with friends, even dating someone new. He was planning some trip out west, had been saving money, and seemed genuinely happy. She said it like it was supposed to make me feel better, but all I could think was how easily he'd moved on while I'd lost everything. Looking back now, I can see how every choice led to the next one, how the excitement I'd been chasing had cost me everything stable and real in my life. Sean wasn't perfect, and our marriage had its problems, but he'd loved me genuinely and consistently. Marcus had offered passion and adventure, but it was all surface. There was nothing solid underneath to build a life on. My family had tried to warn me, in their own way, but I'd been so sure I knew better than everyone else. The doctors here keep talking about accountability and making amends, but how do you apologize for destroying everything good in your life? How do you explain to people that you threw away love and security and family for something that turned out to be completely empty? Sean's moved on. My family doesn't trust me. And I'm starting over from less than nothing at an age where most people have their lives figured out. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd talked to Sean about feeling restless instead of looking outside our marriage for excitement. What if I'd suggested we take a trip together, or try new things as a couple, or even go to counseling to work through our problems? But I was so convinced that the grass was greener somewhere else, so sure that I deserved more than what I had, that I never gave us a real chance to grow together. Now I'm the cautionary tale that other people tell, the woman who had everything and threw it away for nothing. I'm the shadow of who I used to be, starting over with nothing but the hard-earned knowledge that some mistakes can't be undone, and some choices echo forever in ways you never see coming.